We learnt what Labor will do on those stage 3 tax cuts last week. It's taken until the end of this week to learn what the coalition at least will not do. Peter Dutton was pressed several times today on what has become the most pressing question for the opposition. Is it considering winding back any tax cuts given to lower and middle income Australians, the more generous ones under Labor's plan? And they, remember, will in all likelihood be legislated and already landing in pay packets by the next election. So would the...
Your own electorate is among those who are going to benefit greatly from these changes to the tax cuts, some 85% of them. You don't want to take money away from them, do you?
And we're not going to. I've been very clear.
So you're not going to stand in the way of these changes as a party?
I've been very clear that the Liberal Party is the party of lower taxes. We always have been. We always will be.
The opposition has deferred on that for several days after Susan Lee initially went a bit ahead of a few others. That's pretty clear, though. So where does that leave the opposition as it weighs up what to do? Here are the options for them, broadly speaking, as they try to position themselves. Keep Labor's changes as is and don't do everything else. But then what happens to the broken promise? It's still a broken promise from Labor, but the coalition's not promising a point of difference. That seems pointless. Partly reinstate what they originally planned for stage 3. So that 37% bracket and the top bracket, it's not as attractive, it's not as different, it's more affordable. Or do they reinstate in full? For that, they must find big savings. So what do some of these changes look like in terms of the cost to the budget? Well, we've crunched those numbers. So the top bracket, this $200,000 bracket, that's actually quite cheap to reinstate. $2 billion over forward estimates. The decade would be $12 billion. So that's relatively easy, but it affects the fewest voters. Removing 37%, that gets a lot more expensive. So $19 billion more over the forward estimates and $91 billion over the decade. Then you get to both of those, $21 billion and $103 billion. So you can see that does get expensive, particularly over the longer term. Maybe there's a combination they work on. Maybe there's a bit of a slower rollout, if you like. So another option, not just reinstating those two previous ones, is to tinker a bit around the 37% bracket. Remember, Labor has that applying at the moment from $135,000. That's when it kicks in. They could move that to $150,000. So you're getting very much more middle Australia with that change. That would cost $7 billion over forwards, $32 billion over the decade. Removing it all together in 2027, so capturing, if you like, the period during the next parliament, but not having as many years in the forward estimates. They're the real years in terms of the budget. So that would again be $7 billion in the forwards, $79 over the decade. Doing both, it's a lower figure here than adding them up because there's some overlap here. $11 billion in the forwards and $83 over decade. The interesting thing about this as well is, look at this figure here, $32 billion. You might say, well, that's a lot over a decade. Remember, Labor's changes, they say, will bring in $28 billion more over the decade. The opposition's been pointing out that's because of bracket creep. So they'd be able to argue that $32 billion, well, it's more like $4 billion because Labor's raising from taxpayers that $28 billion. So the forwards in red will be the more relevant number. And they don't necessarily have to mean that comes off the budget, because that's the other challenge for the coalition. They talk about being the party of lower taxes. As you heard from Peter Dutton, they also want to be the better managers of the budget. So can they manage both? That will be part of the conundrum for them ahead of the next election. They'll be searching for savings, no doubt about that.